So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, and the scripture used is from the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of Yahweh, from the prophets of Israel, giving us then the understanding of the time of the end as per instructions, and then evaluating the scripture of the autumn feast. We begin our quest then, what is it available today where people sometimes they have no clue what they read. So then, revelation in the Bible unfortunately is very twisted. It does not teach the truth. There are many defects, and some of them were done in purpose in order to confuse the people. So then, from the original manuscripts, then we begin our quest understanding the culture of the Hebraic understanding of the scripture, plus then the Aramaic version very similar to Hebrew. So then, in terms of the autumn feast or the first chapter of Revelation, we already have then the structure on how these holy documents should be studied. After a very cautious evaluation of it, the autumn feast truly does not start with the first chapter. Let me give an idea what goes on. When you read then Metityahu, and then the areas related with the Messiah and the initiation of his ministry, we understand it was then precisely 490 days ministry. And then his ministry obviously started himself going around and then recruiting his own people to do the service. However, what the Greco and the Romans depicted as they were translating those documents, it does not portray the understanding of the Messiah. For instance, when the Messiah went to those people, for instance, Metityahu, then Luke, and then the others, he first went to them while they were at work. The Messiah was never involved with saying to the person as a worker, please drop what you are doing, come after me. The Messiah never said those words. Those words was then translated from the Greco-Roman understanding because they were giving orders to people. So try to understand where those understandings are coming from. The Greco-Romans, most particular the Romans, they were then a military country. They were used to give orders to people. And they were not very polite. So when they began to translate the holy documents for their own benefit, they felt that the existing scripture was kind of a wishy-washy. In other words, it was kind of a weak. The Messiah was always a person related with being understanding of the situation. He would never come to the worker during the time of duty and say, drop what you are doing, come after me. What truly the Messiah said was, after your duty, after you finish with your duty, come and visit. Typical of the Messiah. And obviously then he would give him some time, or the person that was invited for the service of the Messiah, to go back to the employer and give the employer the notice. This way, then the Messiah was a person loyal to the system of the time. He would never say to those people, drop what you are doing, screw with your employer, come after me. No, he never said this. The Messiah would never say those words related with then employers then employing people. So then when we begin to read then in terms of Revelation, or then the autumn feast has the same understanding. For instance, Yohanan, he did not get the orders first from the Messiah, because the Yohanan was in the first holy city of his time. The other holy cities, they were open and they were contaminated with sin, and the Messiah was extremely displeased with them. So then, When we begin to read the autumn feast and the understanding of the cities versus then where Shaliach Yohanan was at, he had to give a time for himself to understand what was and what not, because he experienced the first holy city of his time. So the Messiah would not start the scripture by saying what you observe then write. He had to make sure where the Messiah was coming from, what kind of a voice he was speaking of, where he was taken during the Shabbat, and he was in the spirit in heaven, understanding the relationship of then the autumn feast yet to come and what the Messiah was to give him. So truly, you begin then the understanding of the autumn feast in the 4th chapter. Have this in mind. When you are reading then the autumn feast, you are not reading in flat surfaces. The Greco and the Romans, they always read in flat surfaces, and they always started with the authority part of it. So they personalized the Messiah for their own gain, as starting then with the Messiah giving orders, as it was very popular during the time of the Romans, when you have a person in charge always giving orders. So begin to understand the literary manipulation of the Greco and the Romans as you begin to read the instructions. So then, during the time of the Messiah's ministry, he never said to those workers, drop what you are doing, come after me. The Messiah, no, he was considered to the employers. He was the Messiah, the prophet. He would never jeopardize what they were doing, because then those employers would glance at the Messiah, oh, there he comes stealing the workers. And the Messiah was not in a trade of stealing people. But he did say, come after me after your duties. The same way you find then, obviously, the autumn feast or revelation as the Messiah not giving orders at first. Those were manipulated by the Romans. So truly when the Messiah was speaking with Yohanan, started at the 4th chapter. Because in the 4th chapter then the Messiah identifies himself. Then he identifies as then with this voice of shofars. And then Yohanan is taking first of a tour of the heavenly realm of what then the autumn feast would be taking place in the near future. Then when you read the 4th chapter, he had to be given also the understanding of the tabernacle. Because then Yohanan had to be instructed of the entire understanding of the lineage of the Torah, as per the understanding after these. When the Messiah said after these, he was explaining the lineage of the Torah being completed ever since it was instituted during the time of Moses. So then you find Yohanan in a holy city. You find then the spring feast is gone, is completed. The Messiah then, he was in a holy city with Yohanan while the Torah was completely satisfied. As then if you would give an objective to a worker up to the point where the worker was at, the objective was completed. Then you would say after these. So from the lineage of the Torah, considering the completion of the spring feast and the delegation of responsibilities, then the holy city was ready. So then Yohanan was given a tour of the situation. So then you start reading the 4th chapter. Then what went on with the tabernacle? Because the Messiah was from the 2nd tabernacle services. So he had to be given also an understanding of the tabernacle. After the 7th chapter, you read first the 4th, and then you read the 7th. Previously in some of the videos, while we were studying these documents, myself even mentioned the 4th chapter first, then going to the 1st chapter. No. 4th chapter, And then the 7th chapter, because of the tabernacle layer of understanding of the second tabernacle services and how the Messiah wants to have his tabernacles functioning. Then when you read the 4th chapter, 7th chapter, then you read the 1st chapter from the 11th verse until the 20th verse. Then you resume 2nd and 3rd. Because then when you begin to understand the 1st chapter, the 11th until the 20th, the Messiah then shows his displeasing, because Yohanan was then given a tour of heaven. He was given an understanding of who the Messiah was and what he was doing, what was expected of him in the 7th chapter. Then the Messiah, after giving these understandings to Yohanan, he said then what those cities were involved with. Then you read the rest of it. And then you read the 1st chapter from the 11th through the 20th chapter, the 2nd and the 3rd chapters. Then in sequence, the 5th, 6th, 8th, and 9th, and 10th. So then you have the main structure of the autumn feast from the 4th until the 10th, including 2nd, 3rd, 1st, 5th, 6th, 8th, and 9th. These numbers from 1 to 10, not in chronological order, these form the entire structure of autumn feast. Whatsoever you read has to fit in these structure. So then later we're going to explore more, because then the 10th chapter in fact is the end of the autumn feast, where then Yohanan, after receiving the entire understanding, then he was ordered to go out of the city and then prophesied upon the peoples, nations, and princes and kings. By this time, then, he was already in his city for 36 months. How do we know this? Because of the Creator's calendar. The end of the 1,000 years of Satan ended in 2009. As we understand, 1,000 years was granted him to do his own. Then we are during the time of restoration and also reduction. But then comes the 2012 calendar of the world. This was a discrepancy of then Satan waiting for Yohanan outside of the holy city until he came out. So begin to understand, Yohanan was a Shaliach and he was the last of them. Obviously the enemy will have to have his, in quote, antennas up in order to understand what the heck is going on in the city. And he waited for him. So while then the regular secular calendars were going on, he didn't know how to handle the problem, because he was expecting Yohanan to come out and speak so then he could understand what went on and then continue on with the time. That's why there is a discrepancy of the calendar from 09 and 12. You find a Mayan calendar with one of those stone rings out of precision of 36 months. Nahashatan is not stupid, but he has to have information. However, during the time Yohanan spent in the city, he could not get into the city. The city is holy, and whatsoever takes place in the city is confidential. It's not revealed. But then the time spent, then when Yohanan spoke, after some time, 36 months, then the time began to count in his own calendar. While then the Creator's calendar was already counting previously. So then you begin to understand what it means. So then there is a relation with then the 7th chapter, that would be the second per chronological order of the autumn feast, and is linked up with the 11th and 1:4, chapter 14. And then later you find then other chapters related with these structure as then the events takes place. As we understand, the shofars are linked with the cups. So there is an entire structure that is absolutely being defined as per Yohanan's time during his holy city's time with the Messiah. Because we are simply reviving what was already taught in the past. So then, when you read Revelation then, or Autumn Feast, start then with the 4th chapter, because the Messiah is a Messiah of order in terms of chronological understanding where he's coming from. The Greco and the Romans, particularly the Romans, they want to give orders. So they were posing as a nation being used by Yahweh when they were not being used by Yahweh. But then they want to give orders. So then he began to read the documents in their own understanding. They thought the most important was to straighten out those bad places over there, those cities. So while they were involved with these many Megillas, many documents, there were many of them, they began to make a selection of them. And they came to the point where the Messiah started then with the 4th, then he went to the 7th, and then sections of the 1st. But then when the Greco-Romans, they began to read, they began to put in order or chronological order as per their own culture, as they were always military people, and they began to give orders. So then they began to understand the steps of formation. So please stay tuned, much more coming up, because we're going to develop more of these and come up with the rest of it, so then becomes very coherent, and then we understand more the personality of the Messiah as per the order of his understanding and not pagan understanding. Please stay tuned.